Today's conversation is about whether the Ukraine war risks evolving into a broader European security crisis, especially as the conflict increasingly reaches into Russian territory and Western involvement seems to continue to deepen, and also how the Iran war impacts all of this. To help us understand this, we're joined by Frank Rose, a senior national security leader with 30 years shaping U.S. defense, nuclear deterrence, and space policy across the State Department, Pentagon, and Capitol Hill. Today he leads the Chevalier Strategic Advisors, helping companies and investors navigate the intersection of geopolitics, defense technology, and strategic risk. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Great to have you.
Be on the show.
Great to have you. So we'll go straight into it, Frank. I mean, it seems to me that the Ukraine-Russia war has entered into a new phase, a dangerous phase from what I'm seeing, where Ukraine is striking deep into Russian territory. They're not just targeting military infrastructure, but economic assets such as the oil refineries, really hurting Russia. Do you think this kind of strategy is more likely to pressure Moscow into negotiations, or does it risk kind of hardening Russia's resolve and prolonging the conflict?
Well, that is really the key question. From my perspective, what has happened over the last couple of months is that the Ukrainians have recalibrated their strategy. They have come to the understanding that they are not going to evict the Russians from their territory. So what is their political objective? I think they have made a decision that they need to force the conflict into a ceasefire. And the way to do that, from my perspective, is to impose cost on the Russians, to make it clear to the Russians that it is better to end the conflict than continue it. So how are they doing that? Well, as you noted, they are bringing the war to the Russians and imposing cost in a way they have not done before, specifically hitting the fuel refineries, which is creating serious fuel shortages in Russia. They've also conducted a very sophisticated set of drone attacks on Russian supply ships going over the Sea of Azov into Crimea. So your listeners may be familiar with Karl von Clausewitz. He was a 19th century Prussian military philosopher, and he came up with the phrase, war is an extension of politics. The objective of war is not to just kill people for the sake of killing people. It is to achieve a political aim. And I think what you have seen with the Ukrainians over the last several months is they have developed an integrated political military strategy designed with a clear objective: impose cost on the Russians, especially the population, which until recently was not really feeling the cost of the war, to try to force the Russians to come to the table. Whether it will work or not, that's an open question. But regardless of that, you can say that the Ukrainians do have a strategy.
Interesting. I mean, some people say this is a classic escalation trap whereby the cost for Putin not to act more aggressively is more than the cost of acting aggressively. And therefore, I mean, what we're seeing recently is there's been more attacks on Ukraine and more attacks on their infrastructure, and they're using more of their I forgot the name of that missile, the new one that they recently,
Iskandar,
yeah.
the
Uh,
Iskandar.
yes, and so they're kind of also going deeper. They're kind of matching that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the Russians have been conducting an all-out assault on Ukraine's energy and civilian infrastructure for the past 2.5, 3 years. What has changed has been the fact that the Ukrainians have now developed deep strike capabilities that can hit deep inside of Russia. So is it possible that the Russians could continue to escalate? I guess the answer is yes, but there's not a whole lot more they can do unless they want to go to cross the nuclear threshold. And honestly, I think that is extremely unlikely. Not impossible, because there were concerns about that a couple of years ago. And I was actually in government at the time, and I was involved in some of those discussions. But is it possible? I think the answer is yes. I mean, another thing that Clausewitz says is that wars are unpredictable. You don't know where they will ultimately go. One of my real concerns is that we could have a potential accident in which a Russian missile goes into NATO territory. And this has happened before. It's happened in Poland. It's happened in Ukraine. And it could lead to a spiral between NATO and Russia. That's where I feel that we have real escalation potential. But I would note both sides, both NATO and Russia, have been very, very careful not to overtly escalate the conflict. Now, there's been a lot of press reports about Russia's shadow campaign across Western Europe, but Putin has been very, very careful not to overtly escalate with NATO. And I think one of the reasons for that is NATO has a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, and vice versa. I mean, one of the reasons why NATO has not directly intervened in the war, in my view, is because Russia has a nuclear deterrent. And both sides are cognizant of that fact.
Yeah, I mean, from people that are based in Europe, there is a big worry. As you know, I am based in Europe, and a lot of people I speak to, because we're seeing kind of the actions of the Europeans to, of course, support Ukraine in this, but we're kind of going deeper, and we're standing firmer, and we're supplying a lot of equipment, a lot of intelligence, especially the British over here. So it seems like we're getting there. And then there's the rhetoric from the Russians saying, you guys are too involved in this. You guys, I mean NATO, and we're leading the way to potentially striking you. I think they've said that a couple of times, kind of threatening that, and that's the worry.
I certainly understand the worry. However, I've dealt with the Russians for over 25 years. The Russians clearly understand where the pressure points are in democratic societies. And they say things with the specific purpose of creating concern in Western democratic societies. That said, I think you need to watch the Russian actions. This war has been going on for over 4 years now. Based on what I have seen, there has not been a deliberate, overt strike by the Russians on NATO territory. Now, they have tested, okay, with regards to some of the drone incursions, and NATO has responded relatively quickly to shoot those drones down. That happened especially in the fall of 2025. The International Institute for Strategic Studies came out with a report a couple of weeks ago about mysterious drone incursions in Western Europe, most likely coming from Russian cargo ships. And there has been I would say, covert sabotage campaign across Western Europe, likely run by the Russian security services. But to date, they have demurred from a direct military confrontation with NATO. Why? Well, they've lost, I think, 1.4 million casualties just against the Ukrainians. One war is enough. They don't want to get into a direct confrontation for NATO because, quite frankly, that would not be particularly that good for them from a military perspective. So, bottom line, I understand the concern, but based on what the Russians have done over the last 4.5 years, and we have provided them lots of support, NATO countries, the United States, and its European allies, I don't think that they will overtly expand the conflict. But you never know. I mean, you've got to stay on your toes because wars are unpredictable. That's if history teaches us anything, people don't necessarily always make rational decisions.
Yeah, that's the worry. So Frank, you've spent much of your career working on nuclear deterrence. Has the Ukraine war changed the way kind of policymakers think about deterrence? Or has it confirmed our understanding that parties that have nuclear do not fight directly?
I've been thinking a lot about what are the implications of the Ukraine war for nuclear deterrence. And I've come up with a couple of theories. Whether they are correct or not, we will have to see. The first is this. Ukraine made a decision in 1994 through the Lisbon Protocol to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from the United States, Britain, and Russia. My takeaway from that is the following. Don't give up your nuclear weapons when you have a major power who has displayed hostile intent against you in the past. It turns out that the Budapest memorandum wasn't worth the paper it was written on. So what does that tell other countries? What happens when you voluntarily give up your nuclear weapons? So it could potentially, down the road, lead other nations to say, if I really want to maintain my security, I need to possess a nuclear deterrent. Political commitments aren't worth the paper they're written on. Secondly, nuclear deterrence, as we discussed a little bit earlier, it's alive and well. One of the reasons why the United States has not directly intervened in the war in Ukraine It's because they were concerned about potential nuclear escalation with Russia, especially in the Biden administration. But President Trump has said similar things. And the same thing works for the Russians. There is a reason why the Russians have not attacked the resupply depots in Poland, because the United States has nuclear weapons. The other lesson that I have taken away with regards to nuclear deterrence is that cheap drones can have an impact on your nuclear deterrent. As we saw last summer, the Ukrainians pulled off an incredible operation known as Operation Spiderweb, in which they sent trucks into Russia, which deployed drones that took out a significant portion of the Russian strategic bomber force, thousands of kilometers within Russia. Boy, that was a real wake-up call for me. And I said to myself, if that can happen in Russia, it can happen here in the United States. So we also need to think about how these new and emerging technologies are impacting nuclear deterrence.
Yes, I mean, when I saw that last summer, I thought that was very, very risky, because taking out the strategic bombers of Russia is a very bold move that can really backfire. Now, Russia hasn't taken a huge step regarding that.
Yep.
But it goes to the question of, when is nuclear really used? Is it only used when someone else is kind of going to bomb you, throw a nuclear bomb at you? Or is there other, scenarios where you'd use that?
That's the question we don't know the answer to. I mean, for the last 80 years since the end of the Second World War, nations have refrained from using nuclear weapons because there was concern about nuclear retaliation. Because this idea that you can control nuclear escalation, I don't believe that. Once you start dropping nuclear bombs, the ability to control that, I think, is highly overrated. And I mean, I think, as we talked a little bit earlier, I think there were some real concerns back in 2022 when it looked like the Russian army in the south was going to be defeated conventionally, that the Russians could have used nuclear weapons. So we're entering, in my view, a very, very complicated world in which we're going to have a lot more nuclear players. I mean, one of the things that I've been writing about is China's big nuclear buildup. We are also seeing all of these new technologies, like we were just talking about unmanned systems, that could have strategic effects. For example, the bombers are relatively old. They're dual capable. So, what I would argue is that the Russians were using those bombers to launch missiles against Ukrainian cities. So they were legitimate targets. But one of the things that I am really concerned about is undersea drones and their impact to go after strategic ballistic missile submarines. We've seen in the Ukraine war how the Ukrainians have been able to use unmanned sea vehicles to basically defeat the Russian Black Sea fleet with basically no navy. Given the advances we're seeing in unmanned aerial, but also undersea drones, if I am a strategic planner in the United States, in France, in Russia, in the United Kingdom, I am really concerned about the potential for these drones to go after my strategic nuclear deterrent. And for the United States, the UK, and France, the vast majority of their strategic deterrents are based on submarines. The Russians have some submarine-based forces, but they are much more focused on mobile missiles. However, again, these drones and their ability to provide persistent surveillance, maybe your mobile missiles aren't as secure as we initially thought. And then you combine that with artificial intelligence, the potential for quantum computing down the road, you raise some real questions about the viability of each side's strategic deterrent. You know, the way we have maintained deterrence is through mobility. But when mobility is at risk, that takes you down a number of roads you may not want to go. You get into kind of a use or lose scenario. So I think we are on the way to have to deal with a much more complicated nuclear environment with more players and rapidly evolving technologies that will call into question our long-standing assumptions about the survivability of nuclear weapons. And that is a big deal.
Yeah. It seems like we're in a new world where drones have really changed the game and allowed small players to really have a big punch.
Absolutely. I think it is fundamentally changing the character of war. What do I mean by the character of war? I mean how wars are conducted. And like you said, it is allowing weaker powers to reach out and touch and impose cost on much stronger powers. For example, in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have been able to use long-range drones to hit the oil refinery infrastructure. In the Middle East, the Iranians have been able to use drones to attack ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, driving up oil prices and essentially choking off that valuable choke point in the world, creating tremendous impacts on the global economy. You know, I read an interesting article in the New York Times a month or two ago. It was how the export of helium, which is a byproduct of natural gas, is impacting the production of semiconductors. The older I have become, the more I have realized that the global economy is so interconnected. And what happens in one region of the world, i.e. the Middle East, can have direct impacts in places like East Asia and Taiwan, where they build semiconductors. And my advice to senior decision makers around the world is you need to think in an integrated manner. And the same thing goes to business people. You used to think the market operated all to itself. Not necessarily. You may not think about geopolitics, but geopolitics thinks about you. And indeed, I think one of the more interesting developments we've seen in the business world over the last couple of years is the rise of the chief geopolitical risk officer.
Yes, yes. I want to go back to something you said about Ukraine, which is, one of the lessons that they probably are learning now is that never to give up their weapons, especially the nuclear weapons, even though maybe you could say the value of that has been reduced because of drones. But at the same time, it seems like the lesson we're telling the world is if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you should get one because your security is always going to be challenged. And I think that's the message I feel like we're telling Iran because, you've got the US government currently,
Yes.
They've threatened to wipe out their civilization. They're hitting civilian infrastructure.
Yeah.
And now, interestingly, just this week, they've approved Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium. Isn't that a message to Iran? Get nuclear, basically.
If I were to put myself in the position of the Iranian regime, here's how my strategic thinking would evolve. I would look at the nations that gave up their nuclear capabilities. Ukraine, Libya, Syria, though the Israelis had a role in that. And then I would look at the country who has had a very difficult relationship with the United States, North Korea. How does the United States deal with North Korea vis-a-vis Iran? Very different interactions because North Korea has nuclear weapons. So if I am the Islamic Republic, what do I want to do after seeing several layers of my leadership wiped out, my conventional forces decimated? What do I probably want to do? Obtain a nuclear weapon. Now, their program has probably suffered tremendous damage over the last year or so. So how quickly they could reconstitute that capability, that's an open question. And secondly, given the stranglehold they have been able to place on the global economy through closing the Strait of Hormuz with drones and missiles, using that choke point may be much easier and a lot cheaper. But fundamentally, I need to change the cost equation if I'm Iran. So a nuclear weapon is one way to do that, but probably the easier way to do it is through maintaining that ability to place a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are not stupid. I mean, they have read their Clausewitz as well. You've got to give, I'm not a fan of the Iranian regime, but from a strategist point of view, how they have used their limited capabilities to impose cost on the United States and its partners, it's textbook Clausewitz. What did they do? First, they started launching drones and missiles against the economic infrastructure of the Gulf states, as well as American bases in the Gulf states and Israel. Then they went and immediately began choking off the trade in the Strait of Hormuz. And what did they do by that? They imposed cost on the United States and the entire world economy. And this comes basically from a military pygmy. I mean, it is not even, I would say, uh, 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 it's not a fair fight between the United States. And even with their ballistic missiles, the United States has shot down 90%, 95% of the ballistic missiles that the Iranians have launched in coordination with the Gulf states and the Israelis.
That's based
But
on
it
this is
should,
based on government numbers. We don't know the reality.
that's based on government. Yeah,
Okay.
like I said, we will not know for sure until when the war is concluded and we have the ability to go through the data. But it's pretty high. It's much higher than I expected it to be. It's not perfect. Missile defense is not designed to be perfect. But if you were to tell me that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we would have shot down between around 90% of the drones, even 75% of the drones, I would have been surprised. But, I think what missile defenses have proven is one, that they work. Two, it has blunted to a certain extent the effectiveness of the drone and missile campaign that the Iranians have run, but also that the Russians have run. I mean, no one has said that the anti-drone and anti-missile defense anti-missile campaign that the Ukrainians have conducted has been 100%. But it has been good enough to prevent the Russians from being able to shut down the Ukrainian energy grid and to force capitulation prior to the Ukrainians being in a place to want to negotiate. So, I mean, I think it's played a role. And again, to your point, is it, do we know for sure right now that it's 90 or 95%? No. And, we will have to do a full analysis after the war is over and the data becomes available. But I would say overall, it's been pretty effective.
Yeah, it seems like the Iranian strategy is to deplete the interceptors. Their strategy is that those drones are cheap; they can cost from $5,000 to $20,000. The interceptors, on the other hand, cost about $500,000 to $2 million.
Oh, absolutely. This is a big problem, and I've written about this pretty substantially in numerous articles. Missile defense, what I argue, has worked, but it has a cost curve problem. And, at the beginning of these conflicts, they were using, both the Ukrainians and the U.S. and its allies were using Patriot interceptors, which cost around $4 million a missile to take down drones. And they quickly came to the realization that from an economics perspective was unsustainable. So you needed to come up with a new model. And the Ukrainians have really been the pioneers, in which they have developed counter drone systems designed to take out the drone that are around the same cost as the drones. In some cases, a little bit cheaper. So they use the missile defense systems to take down the ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, and the hypersonic missiles. So it's what I call a high-low mix. And early in the war against Iran, the Gulf states were expending Patriots to take out drones, and they quickly figured out this was not sustainable. So you saw the Ukrainians in the Middle East helping the Gulf states and the United States deploy counter drone systems designed specifically to deal with these low cost drones. Now, that said, things are evolving in real time. Let's take the Shaheeds that the Iranians originally sold to the Russians, who modified them. The original variant were propeller driven, so they were relatively easy to take out with counter drone systems. Well, things have evolved quickly. Now we are seeing jet propelled Shaheeds, which are very difficult to take out with the standard counter drone system.
Are these called the germaniums or?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. But, so they're going to have to evolve quickly. And another thing is that there is a real sharing of information. What the Russians learn in their operations in Ukraine, they share with the Iranians and vice versa. So these things are iterating so quickly. I am a bit concerned from an American perspective is that our system is not designed in a way to quickly iterate. We are so focused on paperwork and procedure that we are not keeping pace with the speed of relevance. And I mean, if there's, again, any concern that I really have or lesson that I take away from this war and its implications for the United States and its allies, is we are in a peacetime mentality, where our potential adversaries are iterating quickly. Now, the Ukrainians, because they have to, are moving quickly. The question is the United States and its allies smart enough to learn the appropriate lessons from the Ukrainians and insert those lessons into our policy programs, doctrines, and budgets? Open question.
Yeah. Recently the Department of War is now requesting $1.5 trillion for their budget for next year. And I think the question is the constraint really the money, or is it actually the ability to produce those things? Well, one, to produce them quickly, and two, produce the right things quickly, because there seems to be one, I guess the manufacturing base is not there, but two, the rare earth minerals. Do they have enough of it, because there's export controls by China, which processes 95%.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I whether we need 1.5 trillion or 1 trillion, I mean, reasonable people can agree to disagree. My general view is that if you look at the threats that the United States and its allies face around the world, maintaining defense spending at around 3% of gross domestic product is not going to allow you to meet your requirements, even if you introduce the types of reforms that are necessary. But the second part of your question is, does the United States have the industrial capacity to produce at scale? And the answer is no. At the end of the Cold War, we made a decision that we did not need mass anymore. We would develop and deploy small numbers of exquisite systems designed for short wars of maybe 30 days. That is not the world that we are in going forward. I think what we are seeing in both Ukraine and the Middle East, these are wars of attrition where mass matters. So the good news is I think people in the United States and allies, especially in Europe, understand that we need to dramatically increase our industrial base. And furthermore, the raw materials. The United States used to produce large amounts of rare earths as well as process rare earths. But in the late 80s, early 90s, with the winding down of the Cold War, environmental protections, and the desire not to have to do this in the United States, we outsourced that all to China. Not necessarily the rare earths themselves. Rare earths aren't that rare, to be honest with you. The United States has plenty of rare earths. The issue really is processing. I believe, and I could be wrong, but 90% of the world's rare earth processing takes place in China. So we can dig all this stuff up we want. We still have to send it to China to get it processed. But, that said, I think, I've been critical of the Trump administration on numerous things, but what they're doing on industrial base, I think is the right set of things. Where I think they need to do better is have more integration with our allies and partners, because I think that's one of the American asymmetric advantages in this competition with Russia and China. And we seem to be squandering that advantage at a time where we need it the most. The other point I would just add on this is that our procedures are antiquated. Specifically, up until the late 1960s, early 1970s, the American governmental system was focused on producing and getting things done. But there's been a paradigm shift in the United States over the last 40 years. The focus, and you see this in our defense acquisition system, has been more on transparency, oversight, accountability, and compliance, and less about ensuring we can get weapons to the warfighter quickly. And if these industrial base changes and the additional funding are going to be effective, we are going to have to fundamentally change the processes that the U.S. government operates under. A colleague of mine, Mark Dunkelman, he's at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. He wrote a wonderful book, Why Nothing Works: Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. And basically, he makes the same argument that I just made. We as a society, not just in the United States, but in the West in general, got too focused on compliance and oversight, and we lost our way. And we really need to bring our processes in government back focused on delivering capabilities. Mark has a really interesting story in the prologue of his book, Why Nothing Works. And it talks about the challenges that New York City had in the late 1970s trying to renovate the ice skating rink in front of the Park Plaza Hotel. And Ed Koch, who was the mayor at the time, had brought in several government agencies over 4 years to try to fix it. And they screwed it up every time. So he finally just threw his hands up and he called a private developer to take care of this problem. And what was the name of that private developer who came in and fixed it? Donald Trump. And, the argument that Marx is fundamentally making is that when government doesn't work, people turn to outsiders who will make it work. It's just a really funny antidote that I think. But going back to his point, we're our worst enemy in the United States. It's our processes. I mean, I helped run the nuclear weapons infrastructure. My biggest problem was we had created a risk-averse culture where nobody wanted to make decisions because they were afraid of either being sued or brought up in front of a congressional committee to get yelled at. And when you're in a geopolitical situation where you're the big guy on the block and you don't have any strategic competitors at a peer level, that's probably okay. But when you are in a very complicated geopolitical environment with numerous competitors and advanced technologies, you got to take some risk. And you've got to create a culture that rewards people who take risk. And you don't denigrate people if they make mistakes. Mistakes happen. But the question is, do you learn and do you improve your systems? And I think this is just a cultural problem we have in Western governments. We're afraid to take risk. We're afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah. And I guess as we're moving into more challenging times, we're going to be forced to take those risks and kind of be bolder with everything that we do. Frank, it's been fascinating really speaking with you. If people wanted to find more about your work, where can they do that?
Well, they can go to my website, and it's www.Chevalier Strategic Advisors. Chevalier is French for knight because I am a knight in Romania. President Basescu, the former president of Romania, made me a knight for being the lead negotiator for the U.S. missile defense base in Romania.
So you stir Frank.
I didn't get a castle. Yeah, I didn't get a castle, but I do have a sword.
Oh, awesome. Well,
but if you go to my website, it has a list of all of my interviews, my writing, as well as some additional background on me and some great pictures.
Awesome. And we'll put that in the show notes. Sir Frank, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.